faith community world, but I'm also a chaplain in the military and been a hospital chaplain. And so the topic that we're going to be talking about is trauma-informed ministry. And being trauma-informed is so very important nowadays, since we are experiencing this collective traumatic experience, as we know as the pandemic, on top of everything else that we will learn from our guest. And I will challenge the MCU. I have brought on a team of people that will rival the Avengers. Very smart, very well experts in their field, and they have lots to bring to us today. And with that, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. The first person that we will be hearing from is our licensed professional counselor on the team, Jocelyn Spence. She is the director of the NBA's Mental Health and Wellness Initiative. She works with all the social entrepreneurs that come through the NBA. On top of that, she has many colleagues and places where she speaks on this topic and other topics of mental wellness. The other person that we have that will be speaking today is the Reverend Don Bennett. She is an ordained pastor in the LCA, which is the Lutheran Church, and currently serves as pastor of the Table congregation in Nashville, Tennessee. And then finally, that we have the Reverend Dr. Irie Session, who many of us know here in the disciples world. She is pastor at the Gathering, which is a new congregation within the Disciples of Christ. And she is also been in leadership positions and is a leader within the National Convocation, which is a ministry of the Disciples of Christ. And with that, we will get started with our first topic, which Jocelyn, she will be helping us to understand what is trauma and what is trauma-informed ministry. Jocelyn, please.
Thank you, Jose, and welcome everyone. I am going to share my screen in just a moment here to get us started on a foundation about what trauma is and what trauma-informed care is. And as I prepare here, I also want to note that sometimes when we talk about trauma, no matter how we're talking about it, people have the potential that they may be triggered. And so if any point during our time of talking today, you find yourself feeling triggered, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. That might be to step away and finish at a later time. You might need to do some breathing or some grounding, looking at 5 things you can see in this space, or holding yourself, doing a hold here, rocking, breathing exercises, as well as taking care of yourself after we have our time together today. I personally have a walk planned for myself, for my self-care, my aftercare. So do what you need to do to take care of yourself. All right, so getting into what is trauma. You may have heard this term many times in many spaces. And trauma is a psychological or emotional response to an event, experience, or series of events that is deeply distressing, disturbing, or life-threatening. Okay, so we know we may hear of a number of different types of experiences that people have: violence, abuse, just any loss, or something that's going to cause a lot of distress in a person. And trauma can have lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and or spiritual well-being. So we see that trauma impacts not just the mental and the emotional, but every area of their lives. And the thing about trauma is that when you are in this event or experience, it is this overwhelming threat to your personhood that clicks on your fight, flight, freeze, or fawn stress response. And you may have heard of fight or flight, freeze, and fawn are ones that people don't talk that much about in comparison to fight or flight. But, freeze is we're pausing in the moment of being overwhelmed. Fawning is when we are acquiescing maybe to, if you would imagine someone who is in a situation where they could be harmed, and instead of fighting or flighting because that could cause more harm to them, they go along with what is being asked of them in that moment, not because they agree with it, but because they're trying to keep themselves safe. And so when we think about the way that our bodies are created, and God was so wonderful in the creation of our bodies and putting this thing inside of us to keep us safe. So that is what our brain and our nervous system is doing, trying to keep us safe. However, for many people who experience a traumatic event, their brain and their nervous system stays stuck in that place of protection mode. And they may be diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or acute stress disorder, and going to have other lasting complications and challenges from the traumatic experience. In addition, trauma can occur at any age, but studies show that long-term effects can happen on children whose brains are developing, and trauma during childhood is often referred to adverse childhood experiences. And we don't have time to go through in depth about adverse childhood experiences, but studies also show about that about 62% of US adults have had at least one ACE, and about 25% have had at least 3 or more adverse childhood experiences. So what you hear here is that a lot of people have experienced trauma, okay? And we want to be mindful of that in our work of ministry. So what is trauma-informed ministry? Well, we have to step back to what is trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care seeks to realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand paths for recovery. So what is trauma, and how can we help people moving through recovering from traumatic events? Recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in patients, clients, congregants, etc., whoever you are working with, recognizing those signs and symptoms of trauma in families and with staff that you are working with. Trauma-informed care also seeks to integrate knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So we being mindful of what we know about trauma in everything that we are doing. And finally, but most importantly, trauma-informed care seeks to actively avoid re-traumatization. So we don't want to be doing things that are going to re-traumatize people or intentionally trigger them. We want to be mindful. And let me note here that oftentimes we don't know everything, right? And so you might do something unintentionally. What's important about that is educating yourself on, again, the signs and symptoms of trauma so that you reduce that risk in what you're doing with people and how you handle it after the fact. Trauma-informed care also has 6 principles that the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration have come up with. And just very briefly, that's safety. Are you creating a space where people are safe? Trustworthiness and transparency. Are we building trust? Are we transparent about what we're doing in the organization, in the space? Do we have peer support in that space? Are we an organization or a church, a space where collaboration is happening, where we're mindful of power differences and the impact that that could potentially have on people who have experienced trauma? We also want to be a space of empowerment where people are, again, able to work together, where people are empowered, where we have a person-centered idea of how we're working with people. So we see people as individuals and we empower them versus giving a one-size-fits-all or focusing on the deficits. And then finally, having cultural humility. And what is that? Being mindful of cultural differences, being mindful of our biases and the stereotypes. Are we acknowledging historical racial trauma? Are we acknowledging things that we're coming into a space that could harm someone around their race, their age, their gender, sexuality, etc.? So in saying all of that brief introduction to this foundation, we might define trauma-informed ministry as ministry that integrates an understanding of trauma and the principles of trauma-informed care into all aspects of ministry with others. Okay. So
Jocelyn, before we get into the hacks, So now we have this brief introduction. I have a couple questions. Wesley should be able to pop up the questions. So, because, a lot of times people come into this, they think they might know what trauma-informed is, maybe not. So the first question, how familiar are you with trauma-informed ministry? That was your first question. So if you take some time to kind of like look at that so that we here can see some of your guys's, your folks' okay, somewhat familiar. Yeah, there we go. Start things coming in. Very familiar, no idea what it was. Okay. And then we got others. ACEs, okay. All right. Wow. So we see here, we got on the first question, how familiar with what trauma-informed ministry is. We have about 14% of you that say that you're very familiar, 63% of you somewhat familiar, and then 23% of you with no idea what it is. But now you do, because Jocelyn just went through it. So, and then when it comes to the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences that we see, 72% of you have 1 to 3 ACEs, and then 23% of you have 4 to 6, and then 5% of you with 7 to 10 ACEs. So with that, Jocelyn, how does this affect when we're looking at hacks that you have for us?
Yeah, I think that, especially in looking at the ACEs question and seeing those numbers that are kind of right on point of what I mentioned before, what they find in studies, as we see that a lot of people here have experienced traumatic experiences. And so we want to be committed to being trauma informed. And it's also important for me to note here that we're talking about being trauma informed, not trauma experts. So you don't have to feel like I need to know everything about trauma. We're being informed so that in the things that we're doing with people, we're able to offer them the care that they need. And so let me get into the hacks here. If you want me to move into the hacks. Okay. So briefly to go through the hacks. First thing that we've started with together today is developing an awareness of trauma. It's important for you to become educated about trauma and the impact of trauma, including your own experiences with trauma, because this is where you develop compassion and sensitivity, and you understand your limits when it comes to other people's experiences. So if you have gone through a particular trauma and you have not been able to, process that, integrate that into your overall narrative, et cetera, then you may have a reaction, a trauma response yourself to someone coming to you in ministry with something that they've experienced. And so you want to know that ahead of time, and you want to work through that. And then also, again, with that compassion and that sensitivity, oftentimes, if you have experienced something, and we know this, you have a similar testimony as some would say, you might have a little bit more compassion for people who are dealing with those things. The other part of developing an awareness of trauma that I want to note that is very important during this time is that you have this awareness of the pandemic as a collective trauma. As Jose mentioned in his opening, right? We're in this collective trauma together, and you want to have an awareness of the trauma responses that to going and gathering together as a congregation. What do I mean by this? If the pandemic is a collective trauma, people are going to have trauma responses to that. I mentioned earlier about the nervous system and how when we have a threat, our brain kicks in and says, we need to go into protect mode to keep ourselves safe, which then sends signals all throughout our body to do a number of different things. So the example that a lot of people are talking about right now is going back to church. coming back into the building, and some people saying, I'm not coming back. And other people framing that as it's a faith issue. Well, you're not having enough faith in God to return or to come outside, etc. The reality of this is that we are spiritual beings, but we have a brain and a body attached to our spirits too, right? And some people maybe their nervous system is saying, no, we cannot leave the house. It is not safe. And until there is a processing of that, until they're engaging with tools to regulate their nervous system, they might not be able to do anything, right? So we want to be mindful of that in ministry, that it's not just about faith, that when it comes to trauma, there's an entire process that's happening within our bodies and mental health in general. There's an entire process happening with our nervous systems, with our brains, that are not just quickly defined in the ways that we may want to define them and handle them. Okay. Second, you want to create a safe space and practice co-regulation. And so what is co-regulation? How are we regulating our nervous systems? How are we bringing ourselves to a more centered and grounded experience together? How are we being a non-anxious presence? A lot of people may be very familiar with that term, right? When I was doing my chaplaincy training, we always talked about being a non-anxious presence in our spiritual care for others. So you want to know, when we're mindful of trauma, that people might be entering the space that you're sharing. They might be entering the congregation. They might enter the conversation. They might enter the worship moment dysregulated. They're not grounded. They're not fully present. They are in that stress response. So knowing that someone might enter in and know they don't want to talk. They don't want to greet their neighbor because they are dysregulated. They're overstimulated. So we want to provide people with options, right? Naming out loud. It's okay if you need to sit in the back and not talk to someone. It's okay if you want to do something different today. If you want to be hybrid, if you want to stay online today, that's fine, right? And naming that, giving people options so that they do feel safe. Also offering consistency. Certain rituals in your order of worship might be regulating for people. Inserting breath work and grounding throughout your time with people, right? Taking a moment to pause and breathe can be very regulating for people and make them feel that they are safe. The other thing is having a plan for dealing with crisis and stress with your staff and congregation because of the impact of acute and traumatic stress. This might seem like something that anybody would think about doing, but often one that is forgotten sometimes when we talk about trauma-informed ministry. So this can include debriefing. If something happens in your community or amongst your congregation or with your staff, do you take the time to actually talk about it? Or do you just say, hey, this thing happened, let's just pray? We want to pray and we need to process. So debriefing, including time off for people to recover from the things that are happening. And that might be extended time, engaging in continued mental and emotional support and encouraging people to get the support that they need with a support group, therapy, etc. And practicing nervous system regulation through the grounding techniques. So as I said, the breathing, the holding, as I mentioned at our start, right? 5 things you can see, just being able to bring yourself back to the present moment and practicing that with people. Finally, it's important for me to name being mindful of trauma-informed theology and language when preparing, preaching, and encouraging others. Do you acknowledge trauma, grief, lament in your ministry, right? Do you handle the congregation and the biblical characters with care and consideration around trauma? Do you consider that? We on social media a couple of weeks ago had a wonderful conversation about during Holy Week, right? Peter denying Jesus. was that because of faith, or was that because of the story, or was that because of his friendship? Or did he do that because he was having a trauma response to the horrific experience of his friend being arrested and soon to be murdered? So thinking about the stories differently and thinking about how you might teach those things in your ministry and talk about them with people. So I know that I have said a lot for us to consider, and you have so much more to hear. I'm going to hand it over to Pastor Don now to share her hacks.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you so much. Friends, it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. I purposely did not prepare slide presentation because some of the things that I'm going to say, I find it important as a pastor and also a person who is part of the LGBTQ community that you hear this from a live voice, that you can put maybe a face with some of this context. So what I have for you today, I do serve in the Deep South. I serve in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a Lutheran pastor, and we are in the middle of the buckle of the Bible Belt, as you all know. And so with our current legislation here in Tennessee toward LGBTQ folks, it is a very difficult time, coupled with coming back into faith-based spaces, sacred spaces, sanctuaries, and church buildings because of the pandemic. So we're kind of putting all of that in a blender today. And what I have for you is really kind of dovetailing on the fabulous work that Jocelyn did to lay out what is trauma-informed care, trauma-informed pastoral care in particular. So what I have for you today is information that I hope you find helpful and useful, not only for yourself, but for the people that you serve. So I'm going to call this RE-work, R-E work. And so the three hacks or tips that I have for you are all going to start with RE. And so the first is about retraining our pastors and our practitioners. And I'm going to call this an us. I put myself in this category. I put those of us who are faith leaders who are responsible for teaching and preaching and leading. And I start out with us because it's a responsibility to our call. It's a responsibility to the ways in which we preach the gospel and we behave in the public square as theologians. So context matters. Context matters for sure. And one of the most important things that we can do as people who serve LGBTQ persons is honor pronouns. The easiest way to do that, if you don't know someone's pronouns, is to ask. And after you ask, honor that. You can trust that a person tells you how they want to be addressed. You can see my name says she, her. That means that those are the pronouns that I use for myself and I expect others to use when they're talking to me or about me. The second portion of retraining pastors and practitioners is to talk about consent. Consent is very, very big because boundaries get trampled very easily. And so this consent that I'm referring to talks about touching another person's body. It is in reference to emails because we have to remember that not everyone is out. In a lot of places, it's not safe for folks to be out. Some folks I know here at the table, I serve folks who are only out while they're here on Sunday evenings. That's it. And so they are either resuming a different gender expression or a different gender identity when they are in their other spaces. And that typically revolves around safety and employment and family and such like. Safety is always a concern. And so this retraining of pastors and practitioners, we always want to put out a BOLO, right? A BOLO, be on the lookout. We want to be on the lookout for triggering language that might be in our bulletins, in our scripture. Definitely, if you have the means to have a bathroom that is inclusive, that would be fabulous for folks who don't identify as male or female. This is particularly important for transgender folks. There are so many online resources that it is, in my humble opinion, inexcusable not to have information. You can throw just about anything in a Google search, and you're gonna hit on something. So if you're curious about anything that I talk about, feel free to email me or Google it, because it'll come right up. And then to be aware that even inside the LGBTQ community, culture matters. A lot of what you hear and learn about and experience today is based upon white culture. And there are different ways of embracing the LGBTQ community as cultures differ. And it's really, as cultures differ, it's really important to do some homework around that, because the ways in which we express ourselves and the way that we live and move and have our being in our particular cultures and context varies. And so it's not a monolith, right? And so those are things that are important. And then finally, in terms of retraining our pastors, we want to look at our biases. We all have bias. That's not a naughty word. That's a real word. We all have biases. I would encourage you to take, in the community, we often call it an LGBT 101. There's 101s, there's 201s. And then, of course, what Jocelyn mentioned earlier, awareness of your own trauma. I cannot underscore enough, if you are a pastor or a practitioner serving with LGBTQ communities or parishioners, it's really important that you check your own self and you figure out where you are with this information. And I don't say that as a setup. I say that because the more informed you are about yourself and your own triggers concerning LGBTQI life and how it relates to trauma and trauma-informed pastoral care, the better it is for everybody, right? It's a much healthier way to move through our pastorate and through our service to others. So the second hack is something I preach a lot about at the table with our folks on Sunday night, and that focuses on them, which is our parishioners and our neighbors. So we are going to talk about reframe, reform, and reclaim. First is reframe. How do we think about scripture, right? What Bible translation are we using? There are so many translations right now, and they're all very nuanced, and they all provide just a little bit different interpretation opportunity. And so it's really important to understand that denominational doctrine can be very alarming. It can also be very death dealing. And when you are providing pastoral care and service, information, teaching, preaching to the LGBTQ community, we have to understand that we are treading on dangerous territory. And so just being mindful that the language and the translation, biblical translation that is used, is often very important to make note of. You have opportunities to rewrite liturgy using expansive language. God is not a boy. God is not a man. And most of the translations that we have here use he language for God, but there's plenty of opportunity and there's plenty of scripture to back up that we use God language in the female and in the non-binary. There's Care for Creation that talks about God as nature. So just being mindful that to expand that language around biblical teaching, and then your scripture study, your word study, your exegesis, multiple translations, these are all available. And I'm not pointing to proof texting. I'm pointing to the ways in which we have opportunities to learn so much more about the story of who God is and how God engages with humanity. So one of the ways that we can help folks in our parish and in our community is to invite them to think about how they accept the invitation to be reflections of God in the world around them, right? We can encourage them to embrace themselves and embrace expanded language for God. So that's important in the reforming, because we want to help folks understand that they have a responsibility to reform how they think about God. And then finally, reclaim, deliberately choosing to reclaim what is life-giving for you. We can encourage our folks to reclaim through self-affirmation, through reading Psalms over ourselves, how we tie ourselves to scripture, where we see ourselves evidenced in pericopes all through scripture. And And then if you are a pastor and you are responsible for liturgical ceremonies, affirmations of baptism, especially for transgender folks, is really, really beautiful. There's naming ceremonies, gender affirmation ceremonies. There's all kinds of opportunities to help folks reclaim, reform, to reframe, reform, and reclaim. And then finally, the third hack is repair. This is a big one because in my most humble opinion, I'm part of this, right? But the institutional church is who caused the breach. And it's the institutional church who must do the work of repairing the breach. This is not, we learn in chaplaincy training not to pull someone's theology out from underneath them, right? So if we are going to do this trauma-informed pastoral care work, we have to go to the people. And I call this the hour, O-U-R, O-U-R, the hour, the collective body. We do this together as people in the pew and people in the pulpit. We do this work together. And so we don't pull people to where we want them to be. We go where they are. That's what Jesus did. He traveled the world talking to people, sitting at their table, in their synagogues, in their places of worship. We have to respect this divide and understand that these conversations are not easy. They are uncomfortable. They are filled with tension, but we have license in Scripture to test and to question, right? Wrestle with those things that cause us angst and then hold fast to that which is good. Lean into that fear if you are an ally, and even if you are a person, an LGBTQ person of faith, lean into that tension, that fear, because it is a form of advocacy and allyship. And then finally, do and be. We have to commit to doing this repair work. We have to commit to being with people in their particular context. And then we have to decide that we are going to live out this new commitment, right? It's not about saving souls. That's what trauma-informed care is not about, saving souls. It's about sharing Christ's love in a way that's life-giving, right? It's not a feel-good. It's not an easy way. It's not cheap grace. The Spirit is responsible for saving souls. We are responsible for spreading the good news and the gospel and being with people. I appreciate your time. I'm going to toss this over to Dr. Irene now. Thank you so much.
So the reason that I am emphasizing Black women's trauma and not just trauma in general, because first of all, my social location is a Black woman. I know about Black women's trauma through my own lived experiences, through the lived experiences of other Black women. But I'm particularly interested in it because I think that Black women are giving and receiving, some Black women are giving and receiving inaccurate information about trauma-informed theology and trauma-informed ministry. In fact, just this week, I heard a Facebook Live from a prominent Black clergywoman who said, and I quote, "We've got to stop preaching trauma-informed messages." She says, this trauma-informed theology where you're always getting better, but never getting well, right? She says you're always in some form of pain. And so her contention was that we've got to stop teaching and preaching trauma-informed theology. My concern with that, and I have many, is that as I continue to listen, her understanding of trauma-informed theology was not accurate. The problem with that is, as of yesterday, that particular live stream had almost 2,000 views and almost 2,000 comments. And in those nearly 2,000 comments, there were only 2 people who offered a corrective for that understanding, for her understanding of trauma-informed theology. And that was me and another Black woman who is a master level social worker. And so I think it's important that this webinar get into the hands of as many people as possible, because there's a lot of misinformation about what it means to be a trauma-informed ministry and what trauma-informed theology is. So let me start this way, right? So why focus on Black women's trauma? Because I believe that when the conditions that create, perpetuate, and sustain Black women's trauma are eradicated, it means, or it will mean, that all oppressive systems and structures would have had to have been dismantled, right? Black women's trauma experiences are intersexual, right? Intersectional, not intersexual, are intersectional, excuse me for that, and are experienced as racial trauma, gender-based trauma, spiritual and religious trauma, and many more kinds of trauma. But I just want to lift up those three: the race-based, gender-based, and spiritual and religious trauma. And one of the things that has happened during the pandemic is that many Black women have formed spaces and spiritual spaces and entrepreneurial spaces in the digital world so that they don't have to be in unsafe spaces that are predominantly white-led spaces. And so that is a byproduct, I think, of being in the pandemic, and Black women having access to digital spaces and social media and getting trained on technology and things of that nature so that they can create their own spaces. I've read material also that talks about many Black people, male and female, but largely female women, who are quitting their jobs and quitting their secular jobs and becoming entrepreneurs for those very same reasons, because the workspaces, predominantly white-led workspaces, have been unsafe for Black women on an emotional and psychological level. And so during the pandemic, they have exercised their agency and creative skills to start businesses for themselves so that they don't have to be subjected to those daily microaggressions and other forms of misogyny and racism in the workplace. So, what are some strategies for eliminating Black women's church trauma? And I want to begin with respect. What do I mean by respect? Respect is shown when we listen to and believe Black women. What is our theology of womanhood, right? Because our respect for women, and specifically our respect for Black women, is often tied to our theological anthropology of the female human, right? What her purpose is, what God's design is for the female human, right? Because if a person or an organization is functioning in such a way that it believes that women in general are subordinate to males, to men, then it's going to carry out its business and its ministry in a certain way. That's why you see so many churches, even now, who don't ordain women, churches that don't allow women to speak from the pulpit. Often women have to stand on the floor because that pulpit is reserved for the male person. And so a beginning way to begin respecting women is to respect women is to think about what you believe about women, period, and what God's intention was for and is for women, right? If you have that patriarchal notion, if you believe that man is to be in charge and that God created man first, you believe, which means the woman is subordinate, then you're going to have a certain level of disrespect for women, in that you won't see them as equal with men. And then another way to think about respect is, particularly as it relates to Black women, is what stereotypes are you functioning under about Black women? What do you believe? What stereotypes have you been taught or learned and believe, or that you hold true about Black women? right? All of these things, the theological anthropology, the stereotypes that you've believed about Black women, keep people and organizations and communities from taking Black women's insights, perspectives, and scholarship and our ways of knowing seriously, right? So the first thing to eliminate, and not necessarily in this order, but this is one of the things, right, that churches and people and organizations can do to begin respecting Black women is to listen to them, to believe them. Then I want to encourage you as a way to think about eliminating Black church women's trauma is to read, right? Read particular things, read womanist and Black feminist scholarship, church-wide, right? Read them for book studies. And if you're a teacher or a preacher, use Black women's scholarship and womanist and feminist scholarship as primary or secondary source material for preaching and Bible lessons. Next, I want to encourage anyone who is thinking about how they may eliminate Black church women's trauma is to reject colorblind theology. In other words, colorblind theology says we don't see color, we see God. Well, when most Black people hear that statement, there is almost immediately a sense that the person saying it cannot be trusted, that they believe or would like Black folk to think they have acquired some kind of spiritual transcendence, right? That they are above being racially biased or even racist. Such thinking is beyond arrogance, right? My co-pastor at the gathering preached a sermon recently, and she asked the question, right? She says, I'm confused about this colorblind theology when God created all these people in all these beautiful colors, right? So reject colorblind theology. Healing from trauma involves recognizing, accepting, and moving through pain. It often means facing what we don't want to face, right? We don't want to have these conversations, particularly white-bodied people don't want to have these conversations about race, about racism, about Black people's trauma, don't want to have it, right? But if we want to eliminate racism, if we want to eliminate these kinds of racialized trauma, we have to have these kinds of conversations. We have to face what we don't want to face, right? So churches and organizations can help eliminate Black women's trauma by walking into the painful truth of how they are and or have participated in Black women's trauma, right? Face it. Ask yourselves the question, right? Which brings me to this fourth strategy for eliminating Black women's trauma, right? Take inventory of all the things your congregation, your ministry, the judicatory or denomination does to make white-bodied people comfortable. Like really think about it and document it, discuss it, discuss those things that you do that are designed to create and maintain the comfort of white-bodied people, right? Engage in dialogue about these things, right? And then strategize to determine new ways of moving forward. Then ask critical questions. And I have one critical question that I want to just give to you, to share with you. There are many critical questions you can ask yourself as a congregation, as a organization, about Black women's trauma, right? So here's a question. What norms, systems, or standards based on an Afrocentric cosmology or worldview has been adopted and implemented by your congregation or your denomination or your organization, right? Because typically the practices, the procedures, the policies of an organization, particularly those that are majority white-bodied people run, or even really any organization, even churches that are in that, it could be a Black church, but if you're in a white denomination, right? Your policies, your procedures, your ways of carrying out business are based on a white mindset, are based on a white supremacist ideology, right? Where white folks' ways of thinking, being, and doing are centered, right? So are there any policies or procedures that are Afrocentric in origin, right? And because if all of the policies and procedures and ways of doing things hold an ideology of white-bodied people, then those won't always and most likely, rarely, will serve the best interests of all the people in the organization, right? Particularly, they won't serve the best interests of the people who are minoritized and marginalized. So what's an example, right, of a ideology or a philosophy or way of thinking that is Afrocentric in nature? Well, what about Ubuntu? Ubuntu is an African philosophical concept that means I am because you are, right? To go further, it is the profound sense that we are human only through the humanity of others, right? So it's thinking about how what we may do, what we may think impacts some other person. It is seeing everyone as created in the image and likeness of our Creator. It's understanding that what impacts you impacts me in one way or another. What would it look like, right, if we created policy and procedure and strategies around that concept? Right? And I'm not talking about appropriation. No. I'm talking about really doing some critical thinking about Ubuntu. I'm talking about acknowledging that it is an Afrocentric philosophy and way of thinking that can be helpful and useful for any community, right? Being very clear about that. And so ask the critical question about the makeup, the policies and procedures. Where do they come from, right? Are any of them based on any non-white cultural experience or perspective? And then finally, I think it's important that any strategy for eliminating Black church women's trauma will require intention and courage. Intention and courage, which means that we must consistently, if we want to eliminate Black church women's trauma, we must consistently choose integrity over our fear, particularly our fear of how white-bodied people will respond. Well, that's it for now. There is one more thing. I think the primary question that we want to ask is, whatever we do, whether it's a ministry, whether it's a judicatory, whether it's a denomination, whether it's a nonprofit, right? Will our ministry, will what we do repair or repeat Black women's traumatic experiences?
Dr. Session, thank you so much for your hacks. Very, very interesting to hear. And I think we need to have that perspective. Again, respect, listen, and believe Black women. Read womanist and Black feminist books. Reject colorblind theology. Assess, take inventory, ask critical questions, and then choose integrity. Awesome. Thank you so much. So now we'll be coming to a portion of our time to go over questions. So if you have any questions for the panelists, please put them in the question box. But we have one question from Matt Thomas, and he says, on gathering and worship, I pastor a very small congregation that is currently alternating between fully online and drive-in worship. One key member in particular is quite resistant to meeting indoors. I floated the idea of using our fellowship hall since it has 3 doors and 8 windows that can be opened for ventilation. Thoughts on moving forward that is the question. Thoughts on moving forward? The congregation seems quite patient to continue as we are, but some folks may be starting to slip away. Jocelyn, this sounds like the topic that you kind of brought up, where people are hesitant about going to indoor worship because not that they have a lack of faith or anything of that nature. It's more of a traumatic response, a response to a trauma that they're dealing with.
Yeah, I want to answer this question from the space of going back to what we understand about trauma-informed care. And then because we have pastors on the panel with us as well, if there's any insight that you all have directly from, your experiences pastoring during the pandemic. But what I would say in moving forward with this, from this framework of trauma-informed ministry and trauma-informed care, we talked about wanting to avoid re-traumatization. And so we want to be mindful of, however you move forward, that you are not creating a space where people would be re-traumatized, and integrating the knowledge about trauma into your policies, procedures, and practices. So if you decide to move forward with being in the, I believe you said the fellowship hall, where you can have more ventilation, what are the procedures that you will have during that time in which people will be able to feel safe, even if you are in person, and making sure that everyone is aware of that. We talked about with the principles of trauma-informed care, that transparency and trustworthiness. So we being transparent about how we are moving forward to make sure that people are feeling safe and that they do feel safe. I think also surveying where people are and what their needs are as far as the pandemic. I know that many people are concerned about losing people from their congregation, their community, because they're not meeting in person. And what will happen, and is it possible to continue to have a hybrid model? Does this one person absolutely need to be in the space and attending to that, right? Because we also talked about having a person-centered response. There's not going to be a one size fits all. So are we still making it safe for each person and what they need, and not leaving them out or forgetting about them?
Yeah, thank you so much. With that answer, Jocelyn, I'm wondering from Reverend Don or Reverend Dr. Session, so when you see that from a pastor's perspective, both of you are pastors in your churches, and what's the initial response that you want to give out into that, something like that? If you had a congregant, a member, a parishioner saying, I'm really sketchy about meeting into this, that sort of thing. And then you have other parishioners that are saying, we just need to get in there and just worship God, that sort of thing. How do you balance those two views out?
Well, in my particular context, and I'm always going to ask y'all, can y'all hear me? Okay. In my particular context, Matt, we actually have a hybrid worship. So we meet in person now twice a month, and every week we are online. So whether we're in person or not, our services are streamed live. And so how I would handle that, I would respect that person's right and feelings about not coming back engaged in person. I would respect that. I would hear that. And I would also ask them what ways that they feel like they could participate and be actively engaged in ministry with us online, digitally. For example, because we have hybrid worship, we have some people who are ministry partners with us. We don't have members, we have ministry partners. We have people that are ministry partners with us that don't live in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and yet they participate in our services. They participate in our services by videoing in advance our call to worship, by videoing them presiding over communion. And so be thinking outside of the box about what can this person do to stay engaged? What ministry opportunities are there for people who don't want to physically be present in the service, right? And help them to think of some things based on maybe what their gifts are, what their skills are. Well, how can they contribute? Because I think we're not going back to the way it was. We're not. And so as pastors, we have to get that settled in our spirits, right? And then I think that will help us maybe to be even more creative and help our people be more creative. Those are my thoughts.
Interestingly, Jose, the table launched January of 2020, and in March of 2020, the world went into shutdown. So, but what I can say is pastoring an LGBTQ-centric ministry, what I have to lift up is that one person's burden can be another person's blessing, and safety for my group. I have folks that still are not safe presenting as their authentic selves. So they, even though they're 5 miles down the road, they still come in, and we too stream. And then, so I do think that hybrid, if a hybrid model is possible to maintain, that we should maintain that, if, you know, in the way that we can, and not to repeat what Dr. Irie said, but those are important things, is to understand why people are not coming personally. What is it that is it a stumbling block, or is it a comfort level? We still allow folks, I still have plenty of folks that mask on Sunday night, and some folks that don't, right? We keep hand sanitizer on the tables. We've done everything that we can do to set the chapel up in ways that people can socially distance if they need to do that. I have asked people, actually, this is a bold thing, but I have had folks say, well, Pastor Don, I don't have my vaccine. Can I come to church? I said, you are so welcome to join us online. We stream every Sunday night at 7 p.m. We would love to have you. And they just look at me, and I said, I have to mandate that people vaccinate. And I'm not saying that you must get a vaccine. What I am saying is that if you want to come to service in person, that is one of our requirements for the safety of the group. And so those are bold statements. They can be a little bit difficult to navigate, but I think that when we stop and ask people why it is they're either attending in service, or they're attending online, or they're calling in from the parking lot. You know, I have folks who got all the way here and just could not muster the emotional bandwidth to get out of the car and come into the building for fear. And so they watched it on Facebook in their car and then went home. So I think it's, you know, we just have to be cognizant of the why.
Yes. Okay. So what I'm hearing, just so that we could help this individual with their struggle, is that I heard that, well, number one from you, Reverend Don, is boundaries, making it crystal clear about the boundaries of what the community, the congregation has set forth. Number two, that it is not a one size fits all sort of thing, but within this boundaries, you work with individuals at the comfort level that they're at and allow people to be who they are. And that with that, you know, sometimes it is, you might lose some people for a time away, but, you know, that doesn't mean that, you know, from your point, Dr. Session, is that if they're just joining online, it doesn't mean that they're separated. You know, we're all community together, and that we just need to work together with each other to figure out how we can be authentically community, authentically the body of Christ. So I hope that answers your question. Let's go on to the next question. Okay, this comes from Don Ingram. How does one distinguish between the sin of cultural appropriation and incorporating multi-ethnic practices into church systems that have been Eurocentric for too long? All right, Dr. Session, that sounds like your field.
Yeah, that's a great question, Don. Thank you so much for asking it, because cultural appropriation is real, right? And it causes and creates negative negative experiences. It creates maybe even some animosity. So, one of the things I think is being very crystal clear. Let's take that phrase Ubuntu that I gave, right? So I think what a congregation can do is to have, if that's a concept that you want to incorporate as a part of your ministry, have some training and education, some classes on what actually that means, but be very clear in your discussion that, this is a concept that we learned about from Dr. Irie Session or some other Black person, and we see that it is, and just explain how it can be useful in our community. And just really talk about how important that concept is and was for the communities of Africa during apartheid and after apartheid. I mean, do some research, right? And understand the concept, and then be very crystal clear of where it's from and how you find value in it, and that it is a concept that can be useful for all people. Right? So that's different from cultural appropriation, when you're not giving anybody any credit, right, from where it came from. You're explaining to your people that we did not come up with this concept, right? But we value it and we believe in what it can do for all people. I hope that's helpful.
Yes. And Pastor Don, I kind of also, like, it's triggering for me also in the sense of when it comes to the LGBTQ community, this appropriation could occur because, I've known some folks that are that wear the colors, the flag and banners and this and that, but to me, it just seems appropriation because that's all it goes to, like they take on this, the LGBT culture, but not really doing anything to help alleviate the oppression of the LGBTQ community. Can you speak a little bit to that also?
Well, that's because we say all things glitter, and glitter is fun, right? Everybody wants fun. I think in terms of appropriation, one thing to lift up is that particularly when kids are coming out, parents who are affirming of their children have a tendency to become very, very socially conscious about what's going on around them, not only at church, but at school and their civic clubs and whatnot. And so oftentimes you'll see parents who will wear pride regalia, pride clothing, right? And it's a way of them saying, I'm proud of my kid. So for our lens, it's a slippery slope for allies, in as much as allies mean well, they mean to show up for us. I don't think that oftentimes allies understand that sometimes they sign themselves up for things that they don't intend to, like danger and slurs and attacks and things of those nature, which are very, very real for us on the daily. But I don't know that it's so much appropriation. Inside the community, we are concerned about cultural appropriation. We talk a lot about cultural appropriation. And so one of the things we do at the table, I can just say, is that we're very cognizant to give credit where credit is due, right? We talk a lot. And I think it's, Dr. Irie, I hope that I'm not speaking for everyone when I say this, but marginal communities have a tendency to have our radar up about a lot of things, because that intersectionality that was mentioned before, it's a real thing. And most of us who are in one marginal community transcend to another marginal community. Q-pop folks are very, it is very, very difficult. The most dangerous identity on the planet is to be a Black woman, transgender woman of color. And that's just the reality. That's just the reality. Those folks are being murdered for who they are, no other reason.
That's right.
And we have to lift that up. So I don't know that appropriation so much as it is, if you're gonna wear pride swag, just understand what you're wearing.
Yeah, and that goes to, I think, Dawn, this other question that I see up here where someone's asking to talk about the difference or talk about the term ally, how it can become harmful in white body congregations in their effort to be supportive of POCs, right, of people of color. Because what I hear you talking about, Gail, Dawn, and Jose, about the LGBTQIA swag is, don't just wear it, but do something about it, right? And that's what I hear Carmen asking, right? When I don't use the term ally, my congregation doesn't, we use co-conspirators, right? Because an act for us, ally, for many people of color, ally is someone who I'm in your corner, but are you risking anything? See, co-conspirators risk things. They risk their comfort. They risk speaking up and being isolated and marginalized, right? They put something on the line, right, to align with LGBTQ folks, with Black folks, with Latinx folks, right, with Indigenous people. They put something on the line. And that's, I think that's the difference of how we see those two phrases.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's awesome. I love that answer. And what the term intersectionality that came up, and I kind of want to ask Jocelyn's point of view when you hear those terms and hearing all the intersectionality that we have, especially when it comes to oppression for folks. And, we identified one particular part of our community that is very oppressed just because of the intersectionality of everything. How do we help people when we're trying to be informative, and this coming from Michael Phelps and or Michelle Phelps, I'm sorry, to answer this question of like, who do we need to have if we're trying to inform folks and they've been traumatized of what happens if those memories are embodied or triggered while we're doing the informing part? What should be in place to deal with that, that triggering moment? Who do we need to have there? How do we go approach this to help somebody if we happen to re-traumatize someone?
Yeah, and as I'm looking at this question, what I'm imagining is they are referring to if you're in the middle of perhaps a worship service or an event and someone becomes triggered. Who can be there? What do we do? Do we stop? Do we keep going? I think first, I modeled for us today one of the things that you can do, and that is at the start of whatever it is that you are doing, that you name, hey, this might be challenging for some people, what we're talking about today. You could potentially be triggered. In the event that happens, here's some things that you may be able to do for yourself, right? If you need to step out, if you need to engage in some grounding techniques in the moment to get yourself recentered. I talked about breathing. I talked about, using your 5 senses, 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, holding, those sorts of things. So naming ahead of time what people can do when you're going to have a conversation or engage in content that could be triggering. The other part is just on a regular basis, being a congregation in a space that practices these skills on a regular basis, and that talks about these things on a regular basis so that people kind of automatically know what they can do. I would also say if your congregation can have a safe place, right? A safe room. If you have a person that you identify as, this is our safe person, that if something happens, you can connect with this person during service. That could be if you have, perhaps you have a mental health professional in your congregation or chaplain or someone who is willing to serve in that role, and they have some training, some education, et cetera, to be able to do that. The other piece is connecting people with the resources that may be available in the community to engage in that aftercare. So after the service, being able to talk about, here's what happened. You've started to feel some sort of way. I think you might have had a trauma response. Let me connect you with someone who can help you with that. Let me encourage you, perhaps if you don't have a therapist, to have one. I will also say that for a resource for people, May is Mental Health Awareness Month. We are coming into that. And during the month of May at the NBA, we'll be sharing a lot of resources about mental health. And one of those things is a video and some content that we'll be sharing to help people walk through how to create mental health resources for their congregation. So certainly, looking out for that can also help you when you think about how can we be more of a trauma-informed space that has resources already available for people when they are in need of care. But most importantly, I will repeat, in the moment that someone is traumatized, you want to help them regulate their nervous system. And so having a safe space and engaging in some grounding tools is important.
Oh, wow. Yes. Thank you so much.
Can I say
yeah, please, Dr. Sessions.
Just a little bit. It is really an example of what Jocelyn just shared. At our congregation, we are trying to be a trauma-informed space. I'm not going to say we're 100% there. We're in progress. Not too long ago, our co-pastor preached a wonderful sermon, and she was talking about vulnerability. Well, there was a Black lesbian woman we all love in our congregation. When she heard the word vulnerability, it was something about that. As she was thinking about her own life and how it took her so long to come out and to risk the vulnerability and the ways that she's been hurt. And so that word vulnerability was a trigger for her. Mm-hmm. Well, in our congregation, we have after every service, after every sermon, what we call talk back to the text. So we don't leave the space without people having an opportunity to ask questions or comment about what they just heard. And so this was brought up in our talk back. And so that gave us as pastors an opportunity to minister to her and provide resources for her and talk to her and even create more sermons that could unpack vulnerability in ways that she could better receive it and understand it. And so that is a real life illustration of someone who had a trauma response in the moment, but how it was addressed. And so it involves creating a culture, an environment of safety, right? Where people feel free to tell their truth about when they have been triggered. And I feel like in some ways we've done that.
Wow. So creating space is like a safe space, not just space. Creating safe space is very important in this work of being trauma informed and trying to have that conversation. And Rebecca Littlejohn had the question of generational differences when you're trying to be a trauma informed community. She gives the example, younger folks in my church, under 60 or so, are pretty open to talking about difficult things, lament, grief, racism, et cetera. But my older folks seem to be staunchly in favor of pressing down all negative emotion and staying positive. Are there ways of framing this that get around the buzzwords and open up the conversation? So do we just do it anyway and pray that they might dare to open up at some point? Pastor Don, do you have any kind of thoughts on this?
Yes, I do. One of my favorite exercises, whether it's a small group or a large group gathering, this would work great with town hall. It addresses cross-generation, right? The reality is that Every generation operates just a little bit differently. It's very similar to cultural differences. Similar, not the same, right? We have to be careful to say that. But one of the ways that we can kind of get at this is in an exercise called a fishbowl. If you're not familiar, you can Google that through Stanford. Stanford University gives a great little PDF on it. Fishbowls are so helpful. And ideally, if you imagine a fishbowl with the fish on the inside and us outside the bowl, right? Talking circles are so helpful because it helps through vicarious learning. So in other words, imagine if we got a bunch of millennials in a conversation, 4 people together, talking openly, talking freely about some of the things that we're reading about in this question. And on the outside of this fishbowl, this conversation, generational folks are getting to hear this wisdom, hear these ways in which young millennials are experiencing trauma and post-pandemic and how it differs from their life pre-pandemic and inside the congregation, outside in the community. Imagine what the older seniors would be able to grapple with and say, oh, you know what? That's how they understand it. That's a game changer. And then if that were to be reversed and young folks, because I love young folks, they're absolutely brilliant. And older folks always say, well, they're just so young. They're just so arrogant. Perhaps it is they have a lack of understanding and wisdom about how a senior generation operates, how they've been acculturated, right? How life was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Very different, very, very different. And so to give opportunities for communities and congregations to have those type of events, turn it into a potluck. That's what we love to do in the ELCA. Feed them and they will come. So that would be my hack for that, because it's a very gentle way to educate and to take care of our folks simultaneously, emotionally, spiritually, and if you include food, physically.
Wow. Thank you so much. That was awesome. And we are running out of time. We're already over, but we'll use this last 5 minutes. Sorry if we couldn't get to your question, but last thing I want to end on is if anybody wanted to connect with you, is there a way to connect with you? Is there a website that they can hop on and reach you at an email address or something like that? Let's go ahead and let's go with Jocelyn first. Is there a way that people can connect with you?
Yes, I see. I want to give a shout out to Natasha Robinson, who has shared our websites. Thank you. So yes, nbacares.org is the NBA's website. NBA Cares is our social media, I think across all of the social media sites. Definitely check us out because, as I said, starting in the month of May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month, we'll be sharing a lot of different resources and stories of people's real stories and creative ways that they've shared their stories of their mental health experiences and where God is in their mental health experiences. So definitely check that out. And I will put my email address, which is just jspence@nbacares.org.
Thank you so much. Reverend Don, would you like to?
Oh, thank you. Yes. So I tried to make the easiest thing I could think of, Nashville Rainbow Pastor at Gmail. That nobody ever asked me how to spell that. It's so easy. And you can find us online at thetable-nashville.org. You can always throw my name in a Google search at the ELCA and it'll pop up. You'll get right to me. And these are conversations. Part of my work is I do a lot of work in communities that are not LGBTQ centric. So a lot of teaching and gentle walking, gentle accompaniment ministry. So please feel free to connect with me. I have a very wide angle lens with which I do this work.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Dr. Session.
Yeah, again, the DigiDeacon has put the website to the gathering in the chat. I've also put my email there. Be happy to connect with you. I also have a business, Dream Big Coaching and Consulting, where I work one-on-one with clergy women in particular who are trying to figure out how to leverage their experience and expertise to create alternative streams of income, as well as do anti-racism education for nonprofit institutions and congregations.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Again, thank you everybody for joining this panel and giving us your wise words. And we needed it so much. For everybody else, we want to say, if you are interested in the replay of this, we will be sending out the replay of this session through email if you registered. Also, it hangs out on our website at newchurchministry.org. I invite you to go there and you can look at past New Church hacks that we've done in the past. The last thing that I wanted to say was that we already have a date selected for the next New Church hacks, which is July 27th. The focus is going to be on youth and children ministry. So there's a lot of questions about that. We'll have a great conversation about that. It's not just going to be like, well, how to sort of thing. It's like, why do we need youth and children ministry, and what kind of issues that come up, you know, especially speaking about trauma-informed care stuff. A lot of things happen in people's childhoods, you know, that sort of thing. So encourage you, again, newchurchministry.org, or also visit our parent website, dsef.org, which is the Disciples Church Extension Fund, who proudly allows us to be here to doing this New Church hacks. So again, thank you, everyone. I hope the rest of your day is blessed, and see you next time.